Right, as you heard, it is exactly 25 years since the country's constitution was adopted. It has been applauded by many as one of the best in the world. But has it lived up to expectations? eNCA's Ayesha Ismael is talking to constitutional experts and civic organizations this morning. She joins us live from Cape Town. Ayesha, I know that you are outside Parliament, and it's going to be very interesting what your guest this morning says to you, especially because he was representing the State Capture Commission of Inquiry when the former president seemingly disrespected the Constitutional Court.
That is indeed so, Maseho, and as we're celebrating 25 years of our Constitution and just talking about how progressive this Constitution is and how liberal the Constitution is, it is the supreme, law of South Africa, and it also defines the duties and also the rights of South African citizens. But as you say, I'm now joined by Advocate Tembeka Ngcukaitobi to help us understand this, what's being called this amazing document. Is it just a document in theory?
Yeah, I mean, the Constitution, I suppose like any Constitution, is a manifesto for freedom. But it is also a mandate for the state on the steps it must take to achieve freedom. In its nature, it is never a completed document. It is always work in progress, and it is always a living document. So that's the general understanding of a constitution. In our context as South Africans, the constitution has been successful in some parts, but it has been unsuccessful in a number of parts. But that lack of success is also largely due to the state's inability and unwillingness to translate some of the mandatory provisions in the Constitution. In one respect, which is in respect of what we call civil and political rights, freedom of speech, freedom to vote, the right to life, the right to dignity, all of those rights are enjoyed. Today we are outside of Parliament, and we can speak freely about criticizing the state without the fear that we will be shut down or locked up. But at the same time, across the road, there are people who slept last night without food, and they have no houses just a kilometer away from where we stand. So it is this internal contradiction between what the document promises and the lived reality of an overwhelming number of poor people.
So how do we hold government accountable?
The Constitution itself contains internal mechanisms for holding government accountable. The primary body in this country that is responsible to translate and implement the Constitution is the executive. Where it fails, the secondary mechanism is Parliament. And Parliament has a lot to answer for in relation to its failure to hold the government accountable for basic things: adequate housing, access to land, inadequate opportunities for jobs, the education system, the healthcare system. And then on a review side, we have courts to hold the government accountable. But none of these institutional mechanisms that are built by the Constitution are ever adequate in themselves. The Constitution should never immobilize the entitlement of the people to protest. In other words, to take their own destiny in their own hands. So we have internal mechanisms, but those internal mechanisms are supported by freedoms that are contained in the Bill of Rights, which includes the freedom of assembly, the freedom of petition, and the freedom of peaceful assembly and protest.
So are the rights in the Constitution, these are guaranteed rights? Now, when it makes me think about a 2000 judgment, the Grootboom judgment. Mrs. Grootboom died after that judgment. She died and she still didn't get her house. So how do we hold those in power accountable to rulings made by the Constitutional Court?
Yes, the law in this country is that the rights are guaranteed, and by guaranteed it means they ought to be implemented. They ought to translate from a piece of paper into a lived reality. Sometimes that doesn't happen. The case in point is the Grootboom situation, where Mrs. Grootboom, at the time of her death, actually didn't have a house. There is some complexity about those provisions of Section 26 and Section 27, because they are contingent upon available resources and they must be achieved on a progressive basis. But still, the government ought to be accountable for budgeting, for planning, and for implementing programs on a long-term basis that would ensure that everyone ultimately has a house. So the problem is often that the state doesn't budget sufficiently for the achievement of rights. This year alone, we have seen actual real declines on social grounds, which itself is a distortion of the entitlements contained in the Constitution.
Now, the Constitution, we're celebrating 25 years of the Constitution, and you say it's a living Constitution, a living document. But there are millions of South Africans who still do not know their rights.
Yes, that is a very, very important point. Because in order for the Constitution to be a living instrument and a living document, it ought to be popularly known. I was astonished myself at the extent to which the provisions of Section 25, when I watched the public hearings, at the extent to which the provisions of Section 25 of the Constitution are misunderstood as a protection of private property, when in reality Section 25 is about transforming property relations. One of the key problems that the state, including Parliament, have failed to do is translating the document and speaking about it in indigenous languages. We have millions of people who do not have ready access to English medium institutions. So the first thing is getting the document understood in indigenous languages, which we have not been able to do. Secondly, it's getting us to talk about the Constitution in local languages, because our own discourses of the Constitution tend to separate it out from the majority of South Africans. And there is something to be said about the education function, especially in relation to schools, the extent to which the schools themselves are contributing to what I call constitutional literacy, and the extent to which each and every student, whether you are studying economics or whether you are studying science, each and every student at university ought to be aware of constitutional literacy.
Thank you so much for your time, sir. And there we heard it, about the fact that there are still millions of South Africans 25 years later still do not know their rights.